Hey everyone, fun fact about me. I am a huge fan of the cyberpunk genre. From the books, to the games, to the movies, even artwork depicting it. I love the dystopian future in which all these stories take place, no matter who writes them. I've even taken to the synthwave style genre simply because they seem to have cyberpunk in mind whenever they're produced, whether it be through the artwork on their albums or even some of the lyrics. So when I heard CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk 2077 was in the making, I became extremely excited about it. CDPR may be best known for their faithful adaptation of the Witcher series, which is one of the reasons I wanted to make this video. When I played The Witcher 3, it made me want to read the base material to see how much it deviated, and much to my surprise, at least with the first two novels, which are just a series of short stories about Geralt's adventures, they were pretty accurate. The little nods to the source material was handled with some of the most respect I've ever seen in an adaptation. It was an incredible joy absorbing myself into the world and learning more and more, and knowing I could rely on CDPR to allow me to play through in a faithful way. That brings us to Cyberpunk 2077. If you're like me, you'll play it and you'll want more, just like I did with The Witcher. So with that said, I want to explore some of the universe of the cyberpunk genre that I think CD Projekt Red will draw from outside of the tabletop game they're adapting, because let's remember, Cyberpunk, it was originally a tabletop game, and just like with The Witcher, CD Projekt Red, they're going to adapt it into their own version. I'll cover a couple of books and authors, quite a few movies, and a few games, with one game in particular having a bit more depth. More on that later, of course, but for now, let's start with books, because like all genres in life, it started with writing. Getting into all of the books involving cyberpunk deserves a video by itself, as there are so many entries. I haven't read them all because I'm not one of those psychotic people that reads all the time, but I have read some of them though, with one of them being particularly important that I'll get into in a moment. But first, I want to talk briefly about the origins of the genre and what exactly is considered cyberpunk. If we're being technical here, the term cyberpunk was created by Bruce Bethke in 1980. He wrote a book, he named it Cyberpunk, and it stuck. But if we're being a bit more practical with the term, it's been around since the 60s. Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was written in 1968, but was considered a new wave science fiction novel, along with all the other cyberpunk novels before the term existed. It was also much different than what someone would conjure in their mind when they hear the word cyberpunk. Nowadays, when we think of the cyberpunk genre, we think of synthetic humanoids, bodies modified with cybernetics, gritty city streets long forgotten by those in power, drugs, sexual freedom, rampant class separation, and other dystopian capitalistic futures, and, of course, virtual reality. But before the year 1984, this wasn't quite the case. There were the dystopian futures featuring some variants of capitalism, but also featured a fair amount of other dystopias, such as post-nuclear war, climate disasters of some sort, or resource scarcity, as well as androids in some form of mind-altering drug or technology. But it was more about the theme of the genre. What does it mean to be human? Quite a few of the novels question what humanity is and what becomes of us if we stray too far from it. A great example of this is in Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, where we see the protagonist hunt down and kill androids that are nearly indistinguishable from humans. And by the end of it, the reader is left wondering, if the androids are so close to humans, looking and practically feeling like us and thinking like us, then what makes them different from humans in the first place? And then what makes us human? It's a theme that became a mainstay in the cyberpunk genre. So, what happened in 1984? Well, there's an author named William Gibson who wrote a book called Neuromancer that established many of the tropes we see today. This novel is where the body mods started to become incorporated, as well as the capitalistic dystopian futures and possibly, and most importantly, virtual reality, or, as it's most commonly called and was established in Neuromancer, the Matrix. His novel also introduced heavy Asian influence, with the west coast of the US and Asia, particularly Japan, melding into one. His Sprawl series, which started with Neuromancer, heavily influenced Shadowrun, a game we'll talk quite a bit about later. It also inspired many of the modern films, books, and TV shows within the genre, such as The Matrix and Altered Carbon. For the sake of not making this video entirely on the literary history of the cyberpunk genre, I think that's as far as I want to go for its origins. There's plenty more to talk about, it's a whole video by itself, but I think this is a good synopsis for what I'm trying to get at. I would like to add that there are a variety of new wave science fiction authors that are quite worth the read, but when you're starting to play Cyberpunk 2077, I think you'll see a lot of influence from these two authors in particular, Philip K. Dick and William Gibson. I wouldn't be surprised if both We Can Remember It For You Wholesale and Johnny Mnemonic, written by Dick and Gibson respectively, influence a mission, character, or storyline in the game. The former is about taking a mental vacation by experiencing memories not of your own, such as a long walk on the beach or a sexual partner. The latter is about an intel carrier who has information implanted in his brain and he delivers it to relevant parties for extraction. These were both adapted to films called Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Johnny Mnemonic with Keanu Reeves. Let's talk a little bit more about Philip K. Dick, because while I mentioned his book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, some of you may know it by another name, a more famous name. Blade Runner is a film by Ridley Scott that was inspired by the aforementioned book. It stars Harrison Ford, Sean Young, and Rutger Hauer. The movie and the source material have very little in common, with Ridley building his own world and backstory using elements from the book, resulting in a very different story and a very different world. What Ridley Scott retained, though, was a theme of what it means to be human. Similar to the book, the protagonist, played by Harrison Ford, hunts androids that are near human. Just like the book, by the end, you start to wonder if perhaps Harrison Ford is the antagonist because of his actions toward beings that just want to live what they consider life. It's an iconic film that influenced everything going forward, from TV shows and films like Battlestar Galactica to video games like Deus Ex, which we'll talk about later, and even Tesla's Cybertruck. I think it's safe to say its influence will make its way into CDPR's take on the genre. It's good to remember that that film came out in 1982, and no other film in the genre would be that influential until 1999 when The Matrix came out, drawing more from William Gibson's work as opposed to Philip K. Dick's, with characters having body modifications and virtual reality playing a prominent role in the plot. It stars Keanu Reeves, who we've already mentioned because he was already in a cyberpunk genre film in the 90s called Johnny Mnemonic. It wasn't near as successful as The Matrix, but it was based on William Gibson's book Johnny Mnemonic. It also stars Lawrence Fishburne, Carrie-Anne Moss, and Hugo Weaving, and honestly, I probably don't need to explain too much about this movie to you. Most of you have probably already seen it, or heard of it, or seen references to it. It's the definitive cyberpunk film for the millennial generation, and brought an entire aesthetic of black latex and leather into the mainstream media. While the style and tropes of the franchise are a little dated these days, and definitely played out, I expect an homage or two to show up in the story of Cyberpunk 2077 somewhere. The fact that CDPR is casting Keanu Reeves, or already has cast Keanu Reeves actually, as Johnny Silverhands in their game shows me that they are paying respect to the genre and are being meticulous and careful, which is kind of why I'm making this video, because I figured they're going to add a lot more than just Keanu Reeves. But even if they don't, you know, they got Keanu Reeves. He's a treasure, he's a gem. I love Keanu Reeves.
Wake the fuck up, samurai. We have a city to burn.
Can't wait to play the game. Anyways, moving on. There are numerous other films worth getting into and actually watching. The first RoboCop is about a man being shot to death only to be revived and turned into a cyborg. There is also the staple of corporate authority proving more powerful than governmental authority. And I'll mention though that if you do go watch this, fair warning, it's very dark and very gruesome, so you've been warned. Another film that's really fun, it's from the mid-90s, pretty cheesy but has a cult following, is called Hackers. And like the name implies, it's about a group of hackers. They're recruited to take on a corporation by hacking them, and each hacker in the film chooses an alias, and one of them being Zero Cool. And I expect that name to be somewhere in Cyberpunk 2077, whether it be a character or even a mission name or somewhere in the Matrix or plastered on a wall. I believe Zero Cool is the main character in Hackers, and the other reason why I expect to see it is because I've noticed that CDPR, they're taking very little references and just putting them in the game as a fun nod. They did one with Fifth Element where they had the multi-pass kind of laid out in their loading screen or one of their promo pictures, which I don't consider Fifth Element a full-fledged cyberpunk film. It's obviously a futuristic science fiction film with some body modifications and things like that, but I don't really categorize it in cyberpunk when I think about it. I didn't even have it on this list until I started talking about it here. But they have it in there, and little nods like that are cool to me. Also, it's worth mentioning that the movie Hackers borrows a lot from an essay written in 1986 by a real hacker called the Hacker Manifesto. It's essentially a set of guidelines to follow as a hacker. It's pretty interesting and worth a read if you got the time and motivation. Sticking with the early 90s, Lawnmower Man 1 and 2 are decent ones, and I say decent as in I like those cheesy films. If you don't, you're probably not going to like them, but whatever. Try them out. The first one is about Pierce Brosnan's character experimenting on a simpleton with drugs and virtual reality, causing him to become super intelligent and a megalomaniac. And the second one brings that character back and sees him create a new virtual empire. And like Hackers, like I said, they're quite dated, but they're fun. I don't know if these two will have any influence on the game, but dumb nostalgia chasers like me will be very excited if they do, because I'm just a nerd like that. One last piece of visual media that I want to mention is actually a series on Netflix called Altered Carbon. It's set in a gritty future where the rich are practically immortal due to their enormous wealth, living in the sky to separate themselves from the lower class citizens. It's a murder mystery that has some of the best world building elements I've seen in a cyberpunk genre from the 2010s. It's also worth mentioning that it too is an adaptation from a series of books by Richard K. Morgan that are worth checking out if you have the time and motivation for those as well. Now, you may not like movies or books, but that's fine. I don't quite understand you, but that's totally fine. You prefer games. Thankfully, I've got a few suggestions there too. Deus Ex Human Revolution and Deus Ex Mankind Divided are two entries in a pretty damn good story. Some would say that it's best to go play the games before Human Revolution, but I disagree. Human Revolution and Mankind Divided hold up very well and are a cohesive story by themselves. Whenever I got into the Deus Ex games, I started with Human Revolution and I was totally fine. And despite it being, I think, like a decade old almost, it still looks very pretty. So I would just start there. Human Revolution is about a detective investigating a plot to cause civil war between Augs, or those augmented, and Naturals, or those not augmented. And then the second game is about the fallout of Human Revolution and the consequences of that game. I'm not going to spoil it too much for you or anything of the sort like that. You can go play it for yourself. It's a very long game with a lot of intricacies, and it has a nice world building element to it as well. I'm going to talk about that now. It builds its world between the two games with some details to give you a little insight into what it's like to live with a rather quasi-oppressive authority figure, as well as the mega corporations who have an endless supply of money to sway public politics and law enforcement. The environments are dirty and gritty in some aspects, but also clean in others, depending on where you're at and if a corporation is around to care about the aesthetics of its establishment. The augmentation features are a cool touch, and it makes for a very fun first-person shooter. The augmentations give you certain abilities, like melee ability or super strength, and they're fun to play around with and prioritize however you want to play the game. The rest of the world is built through people walking around and talking, as they all do, and there's always some sort of thing going on, especially in Mankind Divided. The police oppression is quite heavy in that one. After the fallout of Human Revolution, there's newspapers laying around that you can just read, not to mention books from various tales or cults or any sort of handy guide that people want to read about in their apartment. Oh yeah, that's another thing. You can also break into almost anybody's apartment and just look at their living space. Some of them are clean, some of them are dirty. It's a really cool thing to explore when you just want to go through and explore. Dialogue options during conversations allow for more information during missions, and they also open up more information about humans and characters and plots and environment, everything. It's really cool and how much detail is in the game. And of course, the environment itself, like I mentioned before, is a big part of the world building just based on where you're at and how things look. They're both pretty old. Like I said, I think Human Revolution is approaching a decade years old. So I'm willing to bet most budget systems can run them. The next one I want to talk about is Shadowrun, and holy hell do I love me some Shadowrun. So I'll probably talk about this one a little bit more, and by a little bit more, I mean I'm going to talk about it a lot. Originally, this video is going to be totally about Shadowrun and why you should play it, but I realized the reason I picked it back up after all these years was to prepare myself for some updated Cyberpunk action via Cyberpunk 2077, so I decided to expand the topic. Shadowrun has some really deep and intricate lore that I won't go heavily into because, again, that's its own video, just like the whole literature of Cyberpunk genre, but I'll get into some basics and the ways you can play it and in what forms, because Shadowrun, like the OG Cyberpunk game, started as a pen and paper tabletop. Now, say what you will of me, I've never actually played the tabletop version of Shadowrun. That requires friends who are into that sort of thing, and I only have one of those, and that's not enough to do a tabletop version, so I turned to the video game versions. But I do know the lore and the world are almost the exact same. And within that lore, the world as we knew it changed in a period called the Awakening, which is where magic started to reappear in society. This all has a big backdrop of magic being cyclical and there being a backstory with Mayans and how magic and such was a relevant factor in the world. It's a whole lot. Shadowrun, like I said, is very intricate. There's a lot to it. If anyone who's ever played Warhammer or D&D know that there is so much story into tabletop games, and that's why I have a lot of faith in the Cyberpunk 2077 game being really good, because there's a lot to draw from the source by itself, but also the sources around it, just like Shadowrun does, because it features humans, elves, orcs, trolls, and dragons, kind of like a high fantasy novel would, but they incorporate it into a cyberpunk world very well. I'm gonna get a little bit more into it. In this world, the corporations were giving far more power than what we have in today's world, because remember, Shadowrun was made in like 1980s, and I say remember as if I said it before, which I haven't, but now I have. It was made in like the 1980s, a couple years within the Cyberpunk tabletop game, actually. So the lore has a year-by-year layout of what happened for their world, and you can contrast it to ours. Some of it is similar, it's kind of weird, but in this one, corporations were given far more power than what they'd have in today's world, so they're able to have their own private army, nuclear power plants, such things like that. In addition, there's a virus that ravaged the world before magic came back, killing a quarter of the world's population. This doesn't sound very familiar, and my god, I hope that doesn't become true. But also, the people of the First Nation in the United States are a big power because of their spiritual connection to magic and their ability to harness it more than others once it returns. And there's also a lot of war that happens in the backdrop of where the game takes place. So, just recapping all that, corporations running amok, a virus, kind of like both of those are features today. The United States First Nationers have a spiritual connection and start to reclaim their land because of magic, and there's wars. So, honestly, we're kind of on track for some of that in our real world. That's why I love Shadowrun. That's why I love Cyberpunk, actually, because there's so many little nuggets of truth that I can see in our world today that both frighten and fascinate me. But I digress. I'm going to get back into the story here. Because of all the strife, technological advances were made and people began to mod their bodies and create the Matrix. The Matrix in this game refers to the Matrix just like in the Neuromancer, a digital plane used to safeguard information and allows access to certain system functions and files for whatever corporation or establishment that built it and maintains it. So they're not all connected. A matrix for one corporation won't house the information or systems access for another corporation. They have their own matrices. There are some exceptions to this rule, but for our purposes, we're going to just leave it at that. And that's about all the history of the Shadowrun lore that I'm going to get into. I think it's important because Shadowrun and Cyberpunk, like I said, were made within a couple years apart in the 80s, and I expect CD Projekt Red to be very detailed in this fashion of the world building and such, and there are going to be more than a few nods from Shadowrun in the game. I can almost promise that, because Shadowrun is an extraordinarily influential game in the genre of Cyberpunk. But unlike CDPR's take, Shadowrun is an isometric game, which means it's top-down and point-click, similar to the old Fallout games before Bethesda came and took over. Combat is turn-based in both Meat Space and the Matrix, and Meat Space is lingo for the real world. And the real world, by the way, is also kind of up to interpretation because some people prefer the Matrix within the lore of Shadowrun. Like I said, there's a lot of world building in this game, so some of the lingo is going to come out of nowhere, and it's just all part of the world of Cyberpunk. But I'm going to get back into the actual meat and potatoes of it, if you want to call it that. You level up your character and focus on a particular set of skills, just like any RPG. These range from controlling drones, being a superior decker, or someone who's skilled in Matrix missions, a street samurai, or someone who knows their way around firearms. And remember, since magic is back, you can even be a mage or a shaman in this game. You can get your body modded to provide different benefits, from having reinforced steel plates in your chest for more armor, to having claws implanted in your hands and fingertips for more melee damage, to something as simple as having a data jack installed in your head so you can jack in and out of the Matrix. Each body modification makes you weaker with magic because it strips away the essence of being whole and spiritual. Really nice give or take there. The stories in the game are so varied that they made other stories into expansions. Shadowrun Returns is the latest launch of the series on Steam or Epic, and it has 2 other expansions with fully fleshed out stories set in the same universe as each other. They don't overlap too much, if any, but sometimes a familiar face will pop up from one game to another, letting you know that the world is connected and living. For example, in the Sega Genesis version, which is probably my favorite version of the one I grew up on, it does have a character toward the end called Harley Quinn, and he actually shows up in Shadowrun Returns, and I love that because I'm a nerd and I remember that stuff. In every game, you're a Shadowrunner, or a mercenary for hire who runs in the shadows essentially, and does dirty work for corporations, people of interest, and things of the sort. In every game, you are going to be following a thread of some sort of investigation that ties into an entire tapestry of deception, conspiracy, and revelations, all the while making the money on the side via your shadow runs set up by a Fixer or a Johnson, who are agents that get you jobs and take a percentage of what you make. These games have their own terminology and slang that you'll pick up along the way as you immerse yourself deeper into the dystopian nightmare that is Seattle, Hong Kong, and Berlin, and that's if you decide to stick to the PC versions, because this game goes all the way back to the SNES, and like I said, the Sega Genesis, which is my favorite, and they're good even back then. And of course, there's the tabletop version. Despite me never playing it, I do highly recommend it for anyone who wants the complete experience. I've seen some YouTubes on it, and it makes me wish I did have more friends that were into that sort of thing, but I don't, so I read about it, and that's fine for me. These games draw heavily from William Gibson's Neuromancer, from some of the slang being adopted, the sprawl and the Asian influence over in Seattle and California being adopted, as well as I think the currency, New Yen, which is essentially the Japanese currency, just new put in front of it. And I think that's taken from William Gibson's Neuromancer as well, and it's applied in Shadowrun. The theme of humanity is still there, but presented a bit differently. Since there are metahumans, there's more of a struggle to have a place in society that's been forgotten by the elite. In Shadowrun, you get to make various choices that will affect the outcome of the game, and sometimes these play on that struggle to survive in the underworld. I can make entire essays about this game and how good it is, but I think I'll give it a rest because I could go on and on. And if there's ever a game that sets a standard for heart and soul in the cyberpunk genre, it's definitely Shadowrun. And despite how much I'm looking forward to Cyberpunk 2077, they've got a lot to live up to in my eyes, and it's because of Shadowrun. But if any company can do it, it's CD Projekt Red. Is this a complete and comprehensive list? Absolutely not. There is so much I couldn't cover in this video due to time constraints and focus, and I wanted to stay on a straight path here, but I think it's a good start. I did just realize though that I left out something for anime lovers, so real quick, I'm gonna drop a couple. Ghost in the Shell and Akira are two mangas from the 80s that got their own movies or series, and I can't really say much else on them. I'm not very proficient in anime and manga, and I haven't seen all of Ghost in the Shells because there are a lot of versions of them, but those two should get you started if you're into that sort of thing. And you know what, while I'm at it, I didn't give any love to Bruce Sterling, and I feel like that is a crime in itself. So go check out his short story compilation called Mirror Shades. He's a really good one to follow if you want to explore more of the literary versions of Cyberpunk. And again, I could keep going and prolong this video for hours and hours, so I'm just going to stop there. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this. Thank you very much for joining me. Like, share, and subscribe if you're into all that good stuff. I hope you are. It does help me a lot, and it makes me feel appreciated, and I love feeling appreciated. Feel free to let me know what you think I should have included in the comments section below, and if YouTube comments aren't your thing, hit me up on Twitter. I'm receptive there, and I want to talk about all this. That's why I joined Cyberpunk's subreddit. That's why I want to play Cyberpunk. I want to talk about it, so feel free to talk to me about it. But yeah, until then, thank you very much again for joining me, and I'll see you around.